Hey, welcome. So today, we're diving into a really thought-provoking essay called The Case Against Paul. It takes a look at the Apostle Paul and challenges, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew. Let's break down the main arguments.
The essay kicks things off with this quote, and you can feel the tension right away. This isn't going to be about Paul the saint. Nope. This is all about taking a hard second look at his entire legacy, and that's the core conflict we're going to get into. So the first big claim is actually pretty simple, but it's a huge one. Paul never met the living, breathing Jesus. He never walked with him, never heard him preach. The essay's whole point is that Paul's gospel wasn't built on experience, but on a single vision he had.
And this right here, this is the heart of the whole argument. The essay claims that Jesus taught a gospel of action, compassion, justice, things you do. But Paul, he's supposedly turned all that into a system of theology, of doctrine, of stuff you just have to believe. That's the big shift this whole case is built on.
Okay, so you might be asking, how did one guy have so much power to change things? Well, the essay says it all comes down to where he got his authority from. It calls it a gospel from vision.
And what's really interesting is how the essay uses Paul's own words to make its point. He says it himself, right here in Galatians. He's crystal clear that his gospel didn't come from the other apostles, the guys who actually knew Jesus, but from his own personal revelation.
The essay calls this a private revelation. Think about it. It's a totally solitary experience. There's no one to back it up, no way to verify it, and that's a huge contrast with the apostles back in Jerusalem, whose whole authority came from their shared time and real memories with Jesus.
And to cast even more doubt on this vision, the essay points us to the book of Acts. Turns out there are 3 different accounts of Paul's big conversion moment, and they don't match up. For the author, these contradictions really shake the very foundation of Paul's authority. So, if Paul's gospel came from a totally different place, did it carry a different message? The essay's answer is a big yes, and it lays out what it calls 2 competing gospels. This is where you really see the split, according to the source. On one side, you have Jesus' gospel, which is all about external love, actions you take in the real world. Think feeding the poor. On the other side, you've got Paul's gospel of internal faith, a personal belief happening inside your own head.
To make its point, the essay uses quotes like this one. According to the source, Jesus is always focused on action. Mercy isn't just a feeling, it's something you do, and because you do it, you get it back. See? Action and consequence. And then you get Paul. The essay presents this verse from Romans as a total game changer. Suddenly, being made right with God isn't about works or what you do, but about faith, and faith alone. This is framed as a complete reversal of what Jesus was teaching.
The difference gets even bigger when you look at the end goal. With Jesus, salvation is about transformation, changing your life, changing the world. But with Paul, the essay argues, salvation becomes a transaction. It's almost like a legal deal, where faith is your signature on a contract with God.
All right, so if Paul's ideas were so different, how did they end up at the very center of Christianity? The next part of the essay suggests that Paul's legacy was deliberately shaped and maybe even faked long after he was gone.
The piece brings in modern biblical scholarship to back this up. It turns out, while some letters like Romans are seen as authentically Paul's, a bunch of others are either disputed or are what scholars call pseudonymous. That means they were probably written by someone else using Paul's name to get their ideas out there and build a more structured church.
And within this rewritten legacy, the essay zooms in on one single verse that it says has caused massive damage throughout history. It asks a pretty dramatic question. What is the most dangerous verse Paul ever wrote?
And here it is, Romans 13, verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. The essay argues that these exact words have been the go-to excuse for centuries to demand obedience to power, no matter how corrupt or cruel.
And the consequences? Well, according to the essay, they've been devastating. This one verse has been used to put a holy stamp on tyranny, to justify just rolling over for empires, and to basically tame the wild, radical revolution of love that Jesus started. The essay puts it bluntly. Jesus broke chains, Paul polished them.
So all of this brings us to the essay's final, urgent point. It argues that the reason Paul's voice became the dominant one wasn't some historical accident. It was a choice, and it's a choice that still affects us today.
Why did Paul's theology, his system of belief, win out over Jesus' ethics of action to become the foundation of the church? The source offers a pretty political answer.
Here's how the theory goes.
1. Empires don't make saints out of rebels, they prefer administrators who keep things orderly. 2. A theology focused on internal belief is way easier for an empire to control than a radical demand to care for the poor and marginalized. And 3. By the 4th century, when Christianity was becoming official, Paul's systematic thinking made him the perfect guy to be the architect of the new state religion.
To really hammer the point home, the essay ends with this final, really stark comparison. On one side, you have the radical, world-flipping commands of Jesus, and on the other, what the source presents as Paul's instructions for keeping the social order just as it is.
And so the essay doesn't really end with an answer, it ends with a challenge. It asks us all to decide which path is the true heart of it all, a system that's all about believing the right things, or a life that's all about loving in a radical way. That's a heavy question, and it leaves you to think about the evidence in the case against Paul.
All right, today we're diving into a really provocative essay. It's called The Case Against Paul by Skylar Fiction. And what it does is it basically puts the Gospels of Jesus and Paul side by side, and, well, it raises some pretty huge questions. So let's just get right into it.
So the essay kicks off with this line right here. They call him apostle, theologian, saint, but the truth is far less holy. I mean, wow, that's a heck of an opening line, right? It just immediately throws down the gauntlet and says, hey, that traditional image you have of Paul, let's take a much, much closer look. It's basically telling us that the story of this saint, it's a whole lot more complicated than we've been led to believe. Okay, so this first section gets right to the heart of the matter. It's all about the essay's biggest accusation, which has everything to do with Paul's connection, or really his lack of connection, to the actual historical Jesus.
And here it is. This is the absolute bedrock of the entire argument. Paul never met the living Jesus. I mean, think about that. The other apostles, they walked with him, they ate with him, they heard his stories firsthand. Paul didn't. He wasn't there for any of it. He never heard the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus himself. This one fact, the essay argues, changes everything.
So, that leads to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? If his authority didn't come from actually knowing Jesus, like Peter or James, then where did it come from? How did this outsider, this guy who never even met him, become maybe the single most important figure in shaping what Christianity would become?
Well, here's the answer the essay points to, and it comes from Paul's own writing, Revelation. Paul's whole claim to authority boils down to a vision. He says his gospel wasn't taught to him by any person, it was given to him directly by God in a flash of divine insight. So his entire platform rests on this incredibly personal, solitary experience that, well, you can't exactly verify it, can you?
So what does that mean for the message itself? Well, the essay argues that because Paul's source was so different, a vision instead of, actual conversations, the gospel he preached was also fundamentally different from what Jesus taught. Let's dig into how the essay breaks down those differences.
This quote from the essay really nails the core difference. It says that for Paul, it wasn't about what Jesus taught, the parables, the ethics. It was about what his death accomplished. So according to this argument, Jesus was focused on how to live, while Paul was focused on a single cosmic event, the crucifixion.
And this chart just lays it all out, side by side. You can see the split so clearly. The gospel of Jesus, as the essay presents it, is all about actions and ethics, how you live your life. It's sourced from real lived experience. But then you look at the gospel of Paul, and it's all about faith and belief. Its source is a personal vision. One is about salvation through compassionate living. The other is salvation through a belief system. It's a huge shift.
And this is a really fascinating point the essay makes. It's not just about what Paul said, it's about what he didn't say. Think about the most famous parts of Jesus' teachings, the Beatitudes, all those incredible parables, the Sermon on the Mount. The essay claims that stuff is just gone from Paul's letters. It's as if the whole narrative and ethical core of Jesus' ministry was swapped out for abstract theology.
Okay, so you can probably guess that this massive difference in their messages didn't just slide by. The essay argues it actually led to a pretty serious conflict between Paul and the original apostles who had actually known Jesus.
Now, we're not talking about a polite theological debate over coffee here. Paul himself writes about it. He says, I opposed Peter to his face. To his face. This was a public showdown with the guy who was supposedly the leader of the original followers. It shows a real, deep fracture right at the very beginning of the church.
So, you've got these two competing camps. On one side, you have the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, the guys who actually knew Jesus. Their authority came from memory and direct experience. Their message, the essay says, was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and justice. And then you have Paul. His authority comes from that solitary vision.
and he creates this abstract, kind of portable version of the faith that was perfectly suited to spread across the Roman Empire.
So how did Paul's version of Christianity end up becoming the dominant one? Well, this next part of the essay gets into the legacy of his letters, including the wild fact that a lot of them probably weren't even written by him, and that has some pretty massive consequences.
All right, this is where things get really interesting, especially if you're into this kind of stuff. The essay points to what is a pretty broad scholarly consensus, that out of all the letters with Paul's name on them, maybe only about half are actually authentic. The ones that are considered forgeries, like 1 and 2 Timothy, paint a picture of a very different Paul. He goes from being this fiery, improvisational theologian in his early letters to this institutional, rule-following, patriarchal figure in the later ones.
And you might be thinking, okay, so what if some were forged? Why does that matter? Well, it matters a lot, because the essay argues that some of the most controversial and frankly damaging verses, especially those used to silence women, come from these letters that Paul almost certainly did not write. His name and his reputation were basically co-opted to give weight to ideas that might not have even been his.
But it's not just the forged letters. The essay also takes a hard look at the authentic ones. It zeroes in on this verse from Romans, calling it the most dangerous verse ever canonized. Why? Because for centuries, this one line has been the go-to justification for absolute obedience to earthly rulers, no matter how tyrannical. It's been used to legitimize all kinds of state power.
So the takeaway here is pretty stark. The essay's argument is that this collection of letters, the whole Pauline package, both the real and the forged, became this incredibly powerful tool. But instead of being a tool for liberation, it was often used to do the opposite, to prop up the status quo, to justify empire, patriarchy, and even slavery. And that brings us to the end of the essay. And it all boils down to a choice. A really stark choice between two completely different paths, two gospels that the essay argues just can't be reconciled. The essay really drives this home with some quick side-by-side comparisons. Jesus says, love your enemies. The Pauline tradition has verses that say, obey your masters. The contrast is pretty jarring.
And it keeps going. Jesus says, sell all you have and follow me, a totally radical economic idea. Paul, on the other hand, says, if a man will not work, let him not eat. The essay presents this as a choice between radical compassion and, well, social order.
So what's the ultimate difference? According to the essay, the gospel of Jesus is about building a new world, a more just world. The gospel of Paul, it argues, ends up justifying the world as it is, with all its power structures and inequalities left in place.
And so, we're left with the essay's final, provocative question. What is it all about? Is it about a system that believes, or a life that loves? The essay forces you to confront that choice, and its final argument is that this very choice is still at the heart of Christianity today.
Today, we're diving into a really provocative cinematic essay that takes a hard look at one of history's most influential figures, Paul of Tarsus. It builds this bold, challenging case, basically arguing that the version of Christianity we know today might have been shaped more by Paul than by Jesus himself. The essay kicks things off with this powerful statement, right away setting the stage for its core argument. This isn't just some minor critique, it's a fundamental challenge to Paul's role. It suggests that the architect of the church may have built something very, very different from what its namesake actually intended. And that, right there, is the question at the heart of this whole thing. The essay frames its analysis like a legal case, and it builds that case piece by piece, starting with what it calls the most undeniable fact of all. So, let's get into the first part of that case. It's all about establishing this fundamental, and I mean huge, disconnect between the two central figures of the New Testament. Okay, so the first piece of evidence the essay puts on the table is this. Paul never actually met Jesus in person. He didn't walk with him, he didn't hear him preach, he didn't see any of his actions firsthand. The source argues this is absolutely crucial, because it means his knowledge and his authority had to come from somewhere else entirely. So you might be asking, if Paul never met Jesus, where did his gospel even come from? Well, the second part of the case digs into exactly that, contrasting Paul's source of authority with that of the apostles who actually knew Jesus. And what's so interesting here is that the essay uses Paul's own words as evidence. I mean, he's not hiding it, he's shouting it from the rooftops. He says, point blank, his authority doesn't come from the historical Jesus, it doesn't come from his followers, it came directly from a vision he had. The essay calls this private revelation, and this is a really key idea for the whole argument. It means Paul's entire theological framework, the very foundation of so much Christian doctrine, is built on a personal experience that, by its very nature, can't be confirmed or verified by anyone else. And you can see how this sets up the first major battle inside the early church. On one side, you've got guys like Peter and James, who are working from their direct, lived memories of being with Jesus. And on the other side, you've got Paul, working from his private vision. The essay argues this wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental clash between two totally different sources of truth. Now, this conflict between memory and vision wasn't just about who was in charge. It actually led to a deep split in the message itself. And this brings us to the real theological core of the essay's argument: the claim that Paul's gospel is fundamentally different from the gospel of Jesus. So look at this breakdown. The essay lays it out side by side. It argues Jesus preached a gospel of external action. It was about what you do, feeding the hungry, caring for the poor, showing mercy. But Paul, the essay presents him as preaching a gospel of internal faith. For him, salvation comes from what you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth. The source uses this incredible metaphor to make its point. It says Paul's work was like the carpenter's blueprints buried beneath marble columns. The idea is that Paul's complex philosophical theology, the marble columns, was built right on top of and ultimately ended up hiding the simple, practical, ethical teachings of Jesus the carpenter. And get this is a piece of evidence that the essay presents that might really surprise you. If you actually read Paul's letters, you find almost nothing about Jesus' life. The parables, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the very core of Jesus' moral teaching, it's pretty much all missing. The focus is almost entirely on the meaning of his death and resurrection. But here's where it gets even more complicated. What if Paul didn't even write everything that's attributed to him? The next part of the case brings modern scholarship into the mix, and it starts questioning who actually wrote these letters. Okay, now this is fascinating. The essay points out that there's a pretty broad consensus among New Testament scholars. They've looked at the writing styles, the vocabulary, the theology, and they've concluded that out of the letters traditionally credited to Paul, maybe only about 7 are legit. The other half, they're either heavily disputed or seen as outright forgeries written in his name. So why does that matter? Well, according to the essay, these later forged letters show a huge shift. The passionate, fiery, sometimes kind of chaotic Paul from the real letters gets replaced by this calm, orderly administrator who's all about sound doctrine and building a church hierarchy. The essay argues these forgeries were basically used to create a more institutional, top-down church, all in Paul's name. And this isn't just some dusty academic debate, right? It has huge real-world consequences. The essay highlights this verse from 1 Timothy, which is one of the letters widely considered a forgery. This line has been used for centuries to justify silencing women. So the argument here is that a really damaging doctrine got its authority from a letter that, according to the source, Paul didn't even write. And yeah, the source really doesn't pull any punches here. It claims that verses from both the authentic and the disputed letters, like the command in Romans 13 to obey your masters, have been weaponized throughout history to justify all kinds of oppression, from slavery to dictatorships, all under the supposed authority of the Apostle Paul. Okay, so after laying out all this evidence, the essay basically brings it all home, presenting us with what it sees as a final, very stark choice. Just look at this comparison. It doesn't get much clearer than this. On one side, you have Jesus, challenging power, overturning tables, telling people to love their enemies. On the other side, you have Paul, in passages like Romans 13, telling people to submit to the government because it was put there by God. The essay argues that these aren't just slightly different takes, they're fundamentally opposing ways of seeing the world. So the big question is, why did Paul's version win? Well, the essay offers a pretty compelling theory. Empires don't make saints out of rebels. The radical message of Jesus was a threat to the Roman Empire. But Paul's message, which called for social order and submission, that was something an empire could work with. It was much easier to adopt, control, and turn it into an institution. And this is really the climax of the whole argument, boiling everything down to 2 competing paths. Is it about a life of active love that tries to build a more just world, what the essay calls the cross of resistance? Or is it about a system of belief that can be used to justify the world as it currently is, which it calls the sword of submission? And in the end, that's where this cinematic essay leaves us. It doesn't hand you an answer. It kind of puts the ball back in our court. After presenting its whole case against Paul, it asks us to look at history, to look at the world, and to decide for ourselves which legacy, which gospel truly survived. It's a heavy thought to end on for sure, and one that makes you rethink the very foundations of a faith that shaped our world.